Namaste dear students. In this video, we'll try to understand the role of non-state actors and state terrorism in international terrorism. Basically, how non-state actors and states both are responsible in the spreading of the menace of terrorism. The central question of this particular lecture is whether state and non-state actors are isolated or they work together in a very complex relationship in today's fourth generation warfare. That we will try to understand in this video. As we all know that terrorism is much more than a law and order problem. We all understand that in the primary level it can be connected with all other problems like law and order problems, but the impact of terrorism is much more than its physical connection. That is, the psychological impact of terrorism always outnumbers the psychological effect is out of proportion to its physical effect. The image of 26/11 or 9/11 attacks still have some impact on our mind. They basically tried to influence those who are living, the public and the government. The target was not just to kill, but also to pressurize the government to do or not to do something and create an impact in public mind for a long time. Yes, it is difficult to define terrorism, particularly for two reasons. Number one, those who practice it, they do not ever claim that they are following terrorism. They rather argue that they are doing it for a noble cause. They claim to be the Masiha of their own people, of poor people, of depressed people, and sometimes they argue that they are freedom fighters. The next problem is that in case of international terrorism, the states, many countries, they are not having any kind of consensus. They are not coming to an agreement that what is the definition of state. Particularly states from Middle East, they are having some problem with an West-centric idea of terrorism, and they argue that in this process, the rights of the depressed people to element of surprise cannot be taken away in their struggle towards freedom. So for these two reasons particularly, terrorism is not yet defined globally. Although states have defined terrorism for their own purpose, particularly from a legal perspective and within their own territory, like US, UK and of course India has defined terrorism, and on that basis we can say that our terrorists in our land are like radical Sikh organizations, radical Tamil organizations, jihadi organizations and radical leftist organizations. Like we have Babbar Khalsa from radical Sikh organization. They have been tagged as terrorist organizations. LTTE, ULFA, SIMI, CPI-ML, all of them have been tagged as terrorist organizations. Since state is sovereign within its own territory, it is easy for them to categorize that who is a terrorist and who is not. It's basically very easy for a state to brand or to tag a particular non-state actor as a terrorist organizations. Although in our case, in Indian case, we have also pointed out that Pakistan is a major source of terrorism or the epicenter of terrorism. I'll come to that point later, but primarily the state generally categorize or point out or tag non-state actors as terrorists. Now let us try to understand that what are these non-state actors in case of terrorism and what does state terrorism mean. To begin with non-state actors, these are groups that target government establishments, buildings, agencies, army, police, etc., with a small number of people and with an element of surprise. They have specific targets and so-called logic behind their attacks. In our case, we have seen that terrorists earlier hijacked Flight 814. They attacked our parliament. They attacked our place of religious worship. They attacked Indian Railway. They assassinated our former prime ministers. All these were done by non-state actors. These non-state actors may even be driven by ethnicity, religion, etc. In that case, they target their opponents. Often the civilians are the targets of the so-called non-state actors. As we have seen in Mumbai VT in the event of 26/11, many people died. And it was not just the centers of trade or coffee shop or hotels. It was a station, a railway station where many Aam Admi or general people were traveling. So they were the targets, being they considering that these people are not my people. So that is why they were their target. In some cases, they have some political demand. That's why they go for terrorism. They claim from the government, or they pressurize the government to do or not to do something. For example, Kandahar hijack that took place particularly with the motive to pressurize the Indian government to release Masood Azhar, who later became a major threat for India. On the other side, we have some other examples like LTTE. LTTE followed the path of terror and challenged the integrity of Sri Lankan state, including the assassination of our former Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi. Now, LTTE is an example of non-state actor that is involved in terror activities. They do not have any particular territory. Often, terrorist organizations who are so-called non-state actors like ISIS, they have a fixed territory, although they are not recognized by the international community or any other state as a state. But they have some area under their control, like LTTE had. Northern and northeastern part of Sri Lanka was under their control. So physical territory they often occupy or capture or enjoy, but nevertheless, the legality is always questioned of that particular occupation. And that is why they, even if they claim to be a state, as ISIS did, they said that we are Islamic State of such and such places. LTTE claimed that Tamil Yalam, that means Tamil state, but it was not recognized by any other state as state. So, even if they claim to be a state, they do not actually accepted or acknowledged as state by any other members of the global community, whether it's state or some other kind of non-state actors. Coming to the question of state being the only agency who enjoys monopoly over use of violence, often legitimizes its crime, at least inside its territory. That is, state is not always the masiha for its own people. It's not always a follower of welfarism, democracy, republicanism, sovereignty, secularism or whatnot. State often becomes the oppressor towards its people. Now, whether they are own people or not, that becomes actually the question, because in some cases, state considers some people as not their own people. And in order to homogenize the entire society, the state system, they assert some kind of rules, regulations, do's and don'ts that often they violate for their cultural reasons. The oppression starts from the state's side. Now let me give you some example. In case of Sri Lanka, we have seen that LTTE often followed the path of terrorism, but it's the Sri Lankan state that was also responsible for this kind of uprising from the Tamil people. Tamils were massacred, raped, they were forced to migrate, and they had no cultural rights. They almost lost their linguistic rights. This policy of Sri Lankan state machineries, particularly army, how they tried to homogenize and torture the ordinary Tamil people. This case or this policy or practice by the Sri Lankan state is of course a practice of state terror. By this, they somehow wanted or tried to assert fear among people, and fear is most important in terrorism. Some agencies, for some time, they considered that fear works. Fear works to maintain law and order, and fear works to somehow solve my problem in governance. So that is why they foster fear through multiple agencies, as Sri Lankan state did. We see the same case against the Kurdish people by the state of Turkey for ages, for millennium, for 100 years nearly. The Turkey state is oppressing the Kurdish people, even to the extent that you cannot utter the word Kurdistan. You cannot talk about Kurdish sovereignty or freedom, and you cannot speak in your own language. These kind of oppressions went terribly against the Kurdish people who are in the southern side of Turkey. Next comes Iraq, how they dealt with their own Shia people. That was horrible. And Saddam Hussein particularly ordered everyone to oppress them, to butcher them, to rape them. All their agencies like army were after the Shia people, and that's why they had to migrate, and later it became a war between Iraq and Iran. Also, we see the same case with Pakistan against its own Balochi people. Balochistan, a part of Pakistan, even today, which is 40% in territory and 5% in its population, the Pakistani state, which is mostly occupied by the Urdu-speaking Punjabis, they are horribly against these Balochi people, since they have a different culture, different language, different belief system, different way of life. And these people are not really tolerated by the Pakistani state. That's why they believe in raping them, abducting them, killing them, and denying any kind of human rights to these people. They also do the same thing with their religious minorities like Hindus, Christians, and Ahmadis. The concept of dichotomy between state and non-state actors in international terrorism is outdated, impractical, and West-centric. The reality in our part of the globe is state and non-state actors, they work together against some other state. So if we consider that these state and non-state actors, they're essentially hostile to each other and work against each other, it does not reflect the reality. So the present day or contemporary thinkers on warfare, they argue that in this fourth generation warfare or hybrid warfare that we are going through presently, the state and non-state actors, they work together, and we need to find out this particular point. And when non-state actors are involved in warfare, they do it in forms of terrorism. And that is why these thinkers, they argue that terrorism is nothing but war by another means. So there is no point in fundamentally isolating the concept of war and the concept of terrorism. Some groups are involved in terrorism particularly because the states backing them cannot get into a full-term traditional idea of war at that point of time. So it is inappropriate to place state and non-state actors in an essential antagonizing relationship in this age of global terrorism. From legal perspective, they may be two very different and antagonizing legal entity, but actually often they work together in a very complex relationship. Before we proceed further, we need to understand few things. Number one, all states are not friendly to each other, and there is a continuous warfare among them or between them. So that is why states are okay to work with those terror organizations or groups or non-state actors who are operating against their own enemy. So this is like friends is friend, and enemy is also a friend. So that is why states often work and cooperate with those non-state actors who believe in terrorism, who are working against their own enemy. That is the simple point. Now the conflicting relationship between states or among states demands long-term war, which may be financially draining, militaristically futile, legally problematic, and morally unacceptable for the entire global community. Yet, that warfare may be essentially important for that particular state's ideology. Like we can talk about Pakistan. Pakistan, they cannot fight a long-term war against India. They cannot financially afford it. They do not have that military capacity. It will be a problem for them. They may face global isolation diplomatically, yet they believe that they have to bleed India through 1,000 cuts, and they believe that even they have to fight for next 1,000 years, they will fight it. So that is why they get involved in fostering terrorism against India with these non-state actors, so-called non-state actors, that they often say that misguided youth. And it is actually beneficial for them because they do not have to employ their regular army. And if they employ regular army, it's a huge diplomatic, militaristic misadventure that may be proved to be a misadventure for them. And that is why it's easy for to employ some fidains against India. Now, terrorism is a major variant, as we are discussing, of fourth generation warfare. It argues, and this particular argument or this argument of fourth generation warfare, they advocate the idea that in future war would be asymmetric in nature, where technology would play a very minimal role, and the non-state actors and states together will employ some tactics that would determine the outcome of the war. And it is not like huge logistics, huge military equipments, huge tanks or something, and they will fight in a border. It's not like that. The fourth generation warfare theories, they argue that it can be inside your territory. Exactly what we are facing or we were facing. Now the menace of terrorism is almost controlled in different parts of our country. But nevertheless, what we were witnessing from, say, late 1995, 96 to 2014 or 15, that in different parts of our country, in cities, Mumbai, Delhi, Hyderabad, we are fighting or we are being attacked by opponents or enemy states. So this aim of terrorists is to defeat enemy internally, psychologically, and whenever these terror incidents took place, we were under fear, and that was their target, to morally downgrade us. According to Van Martin Creveld, the end of the Cold War heralded the birth of fourth generation warfare, which is low intensity conflict terrorism, guerrilla warfare, and civil strife that has rendered obsolete the conventional methods of fighting them. To quote Wilcox and Wilson, future war would be characterized by very small independent action forces or cells acting on mission type orders, a decreased dependence on logistic support, more importance on maneuver. Now we can understand this if we focus on Pakistan as a case study, that how they combine non-state actors and they foster state-sponsored terrorism in India. Now look at Pakistan's history. They were believing in bleeding India through 1,000 cuts from their very inception in 1947. Till say 1971, they were following this track of attacking India whenever they could afford it. They fought wars and got defeated, and finally when they were partitioned, divided, balkanized in 1971 war, and it was a humiliating defeat for them, they could not fight back, and they realized that it is not possible for us financially and militaristically militarily to counter India. Now what is to be done? They, from that point of time, followed the policy of shadow war. And after these late 1980s, after the victory of these American forces over Russians in Afghanistan, where these Fedayins were involved, they were psychologically boosted up, and they believed that they could do the same in India. And they somehow successfully plotted these exodus of the Kashmiri Pandits. Look at the timing of the establishment of Lashkar-e-Toiba. Lashkar-e-Toiba was established exactly on this time period, 1988-89. And what was the target? The target was to balkanize, to cut off Jammu and Kashmir from India and connect with Pakistan. So this Hafiz Muhammad Saeed, who was the leader of Lashkar-e-Toiba, or often called Jamaat Dawa, their aim was to serve the Pakistani purpose. Later, Pakistan went on establishing more this kind of terror outfits. One is Harkatul Mujahideen, led by Masood Azhar, when he was free from Indian jails after that Kandahar episode. He then formed another terror outfit, that is Jaish-e-Mohammed, in 2000. And this Masood Azhar, he was always directly assisted by ISI. They trained them, logistically helped, and he was involved in many terror incidents in different parts of Kashmir, and Parliament attack, and of course Pulwama attack. So we cannot really argue that non-state actors and states, they are two different isolated entities. They work together often. This ISI, Pakistani army, they cannot really always infiltrate and target our establishments, our people, our monuments, our property. But these so-called misguided youth, that is non-state actors, they can do. Legally they can do, and Pakistan at the end can say that they are non-state actors. That is what Pakistan is doing again and again. So we actually see that there is no breach or no divorce or no separation between non-state actors and some of the terror sponsoring states. Now what do? The non-state actors, they conduct terror, they radicalize the youth, they recruit the Fedayins, and which Pakistani regular army can never do. On the other hand, the Pakistani state, they provide logistic support, they train them, they fund them, and they somehow diplomatically in global arena, they promote their ideology in a very subtle sense that, look, these terrorists are born because of they are tortured in different parts by different agencies of India. India is not following the demilitarization in Jammu and Kashmir. I don't know who counts these numbers, that India is putting this number of military or troops in the valley. No one counts, but Pakistan somehow spreads the, and this is called information warfare, where so much information, of course, misguided information and blatant lies are floated to misguide the global community. Even Indians, they often get driven by this kind of information. And they argue that, oh, no, India should have done this and that they are poor people. Often they are not poor people. They are often the Pakistani people recruited by them as Fidain. So these diplomatic warfare and legal cases, these are also funded by Pakistani state. So it will be a blunder if we consider that state and non-state actors, they are two different, distinct and isolated entity in international terrorism. And we consider that Pakistan is the epicenter of terrorism, state that is sponsoring terrorism, and as in UN we argued that Pakistan is the land of pure terror. So the state and the non-state actors are basically two sides of a same coin. Although these kind of arguments are made by many other countries against another country, like we have seen Israel, they point out Iran and Hezbollah, the two sides of the same coin, and what Iranian full-time army cannot do in different parts of Middle East, these are done by Hezbollah terrorists. So and there are some examples that I cannot get into detail for lack of time, but states and non-state actors, they work together often, not always, but they are not always isolated. So to sum up, international terrorism is just war by another means. Thus, radicalizing states often believes in tactical use of terror groups to continue long-term warfare. They make entire ecosystem, human rights organizations, global media, NGO join soon, and these in these fourth generation warfare or hybrid warfare, non-state actors, state actors, media, NGO, human rights organization, of course the dummy NGO or the dummy human rights organizations, they work together to serve the purpose of one particular nation state. With this, thank you, and if you want to find the study material, you can surf the website. Thank you.